Yeah. All right, so thank you everyone a lot for coming. I know that the weather is extremely hot and there's only one thing that you're waiting is to go outside and have a cold drink. So I'll try to make it as entertaining as possible. And I'm super happy that you came here. Hopefully you will learn some interesting things. I'll start right away with some good news and some bad news. Good news is you are your perfect target audience. So yeah, video game developers are creators like thinkers, musicians, and painters. They're driven by the will to create something that doesn't exist. And it's very important because generally as a game developer, the game that you're going to create is a game that you want to see exist, a game that you want to play as a gamer. So a game that you want to play. Bad news is, well, there aren't that many clones of you on this planet, sadly. What you might actually like as an individual, a person, or a studio might not correspond to the expectation or affinities from someone from a different place on the planet with a different cultural background or even gaming background. And that's why you need the power of alchemy, so that your game vision doesn't only speak to people exactly like you, but to the widest possible audience. So let's take a brief moment to appreciate this beautiful slide. I really like the metaphor of alchemy here because what we're trying to do is not to lie about the content, to oversell it or undersell it. The goal here is to find the promises in your game and make them shine like gold universally so that your game vision doesn't only speak to people like you, but also to everyone. And so that, sorry, gamers, when they see your game, they say to themselves, that's my kind of game. All right, so let's start then. Hi, everyone. I'm Desil Basmadjian, Creative Director at Focus Entertainment, one of Europe's leading publisher and developers. Before joining the video game industry, I worked as a freelance film director and visual effects supervisor, specifically in the music video industry and the fashion industry, where I got to work on many, many different projects with various partners on different vision. And that was super enlightening until I joined the video game industry about 6 years ago, joining the awesome teams at Focus, where I got to work on some amazing and successful titles that had quite a wide range of genres. So there was strategy, there was third-person action games, there was narrative games, and that was very enlightening also in terms of how do you communicate on those games. Today, I'm lucky to be working on some very highly anticipated titles like Plague Tale Requiem and Space Marine 2, two titles that I will try to talk a little bit more about today. A couple of words about Focus. So we support developers from every stage of production, from signing the game and the pitch phase up till the release of the game. And today we're going to specifically focus on the marketing aspect of things and specifically on how do you create assets. So the goal of today will be focusing on creative guidelines, which is an extremely important document that we have in our workflow, where the goal is to identify the communication pillars of your game, try to find their strengths and weaknesses, see how they perform in a competitive landscape, and find some key takeaway, key question that you will have to answer during the communication. Next, we'll look at some practical examples. And finally, I'll have a couple of words about timing and purpose of your assets. So before we start, I wanted to share with you a little story. It's a question that I asked myself a lot through the years. Ever since I've been working with moving images, I've often been confronted with a dilemma. Can a music video, can a trailer, can a key art be considered art? Can they be the personal vision of an artist, or do they have to be hard-selling promotional assets? So I'm not gonna lie, 15 years ago, freshly arrived on the market, I was sure that art was everything. And honestly, marketing was a swear word. After exchanging with various clients and partners, I understood that it was a little bit more complex than that. And one example that struck me at the time was a music video from a French hip hop artist. So it was arty and personal. It clearly was a director piece. It was about young, talented actors reenacting their difficult childhood. It really, really felt like the right thing to do. It had a good message. It made the world better. 3 weeks later, same artist releases another music video. Badass rapping, one environment, basic to no lighting, fancy cars, big muscles. And yeah, the views were through the roof. People loved it. Everybody was excited. And it was great for the artist, for the musician in that case. So it raised the question, sometimes maybe what is better for the musician or for the game developer is not necessarily what's the best for the film director. So it's good to have an overview idea of how do you tackle that subject. Thankfully, that's a question that we ask ourselves a lot at Focus, because our team of cinematic artists and graph team, it's in their DNA. They want to create something that doesn't exist, that's personal, that's subjective. But also, ultimately, what's the most important for the developer as well as the publisher is that as much possible players play your game. So how do we do that? Over the years, we've created certain processes that I'm going to share with you today. The goal of those processes is to create a rational foundation that takes into account the competitive landscape. And after that, now that you have this foundation, you can allow yourself to be intuitive and creative because you know where you're going. All right, so if I had to sum up the various elements that we create in our internal marketing team, which is about 50 people at Focus, these would be the key documents that we create. On the top here, you see that it starts with the production green light. So I'm going to give you a couple of words about that. Before the production green light, it's very hard to know exactly the game that you're making. For those who don't know, at least at Focus, this is the moment where the game exits the pre-production stage, that we have a strong vertical slice, and that we say, okay, let's go, let's enter production, we know what we're doing. Here are a couple of things that we have tried to have at this stage. Confirm 3Cs, of course, the core gameplay loop, meta loop, but also the render, some art and lore Bible, and the scope of the game. It's very important that we sort of like wait for this stage to really work on the communication pillars, because before that, it's unpredictable. Maybe something that you consider the USP beforehand might end up not being as exciting as you thought. Or on the contrary, a secondary feature might turn out to be extremely exciting, and you want to capitalize on that. Sadly, most of the time, it's more about, hey, the game is too ambitious, we have to cut half of it. But that's okay, as long as you keep the good half of the game. All right, once we have that, I believe that it's a great moment for the developer and all the teams to take a big step back from the game, look at it in a rational and very transparent, honest way, because after that, once you dive into the journey of developing the game, you're going to be in a very tunneled vision, so it's going to be hard to keep that objectivity. Thankfully, at Focus, our marketing teams are here for that. So let's start with the marketing creative guidelines. That's the document I want to focus mostly on today because it covers a lot of the aspects that we're going to use afterward in the communication. So you've been warned. If you want to leave the room now, the door is over there. I didn't lie to you. So this is a screenshot. I'm not asking you to read it. I know it's impossible. So this is a screenshot from an interactive board called Mural that we use a lot at Focus because it's very dynamic in the usage. It's easy to share, and it's very good for brainstorming ideas. So that's a key document because it allows everybody from the developer to the licensor to the publisher to align their vision and know exactly where everybody is going. So I'll start by doing a little rundown of what we have here. First of all, the identity card. Remember when I was telling you to take a step back from the vision of your game? That's exactly what we're trying to do here, to have a very rational, self-honest approach about it. So genre is self-explanatory, so I'll jump directly onto the logline. It's an exercise that comes from the film industry that I believe is extremely important for your game. So the idea here is to restrict the plot of your game to its absolute essence. Keep in mind, it's not something that you will use in the communication afterward. It's one minimalistic sentence that contains the setting, the main characters, and the stake of the game. Let's see an example. A young man is transported to the past where he must reunite his parents before he and his future cease to exist. Who can guess what film that is? I have a hand here. Yes, Back to the Future, nice one. If I take another example, this time from Plague Tale Requiem, a game developed by Asobo Studio that we'll talk about quite a lot in this presentation. In a brutal medieval world, a young orphan must push her dying brother's supernatural abilities to the limit on a perilous journey to reach a prophesized island. So it's a great exercise because it goes to the very heart of the story that you're telling. It's a first hint at the emotional hook that will be part of the fantasy you're selling. And it's not for story-driven game only. I believe that every single game tells a story. Even a game like Untitled Goose Game or Guitar Hero tells a story in some way. And it's very important that you kind of try to get that emotional hook so that you can inject it in some of your communication pillars. Next, we have structure and characters. Structure is basically your gameplay loop. It can be kill monsters, defeat bosses, upgrade your equipment and perks, uncover stories through cinematic. Characters are your primary, secondary characters, and also the antagonist. But again, since we're talking about video games, you can open your mind a little bit here. For example, maybe the antagonist is the environment, or the main characters are actually factions in the case of an RTS. Then we have tone and style, very important as well. So the tone, think of the tone as like the voice of your game, how character speaks. Is it desperate, cynical, over the top, hopeful, relaxing, heroic? Really take the time to find the right words because you're going to use that tone a lot in your communication and you want it to be coherent across the vast majority of assets. Style will be more about the visuals and the feel as well of the game. It can be realistic and gritty, or it can be colorful and painted. Very important to put all this information. And then the impact is generally one sentence. How would you describe the game in an impactful way to a friend? For example, do whatever it takes to save your brother from a supernatural curse, or kill vampires, liberate the Weird West, and look stylish while doing so. So why do we need all that? The goal again is to take a step back and to see in a very transparent and honest way what our game is actually telling. Next, we have the target affinities or the player affinities. So this is an example from Plague Tale Requiem. The goal here is not necessarily to think of target audiences, but mostly to find what type of games, what type of players will like elements from the game that you're making. So in the case of Plague Tale, we know we have a lot of accessibility in the gameplay, so it has this sort of AAA appeal to it. People who like Last of Us, Uncharted, Tomb Raider, Horizon will find something in the game that they like. Of course, story-driven narrative game fans, people who like Hellblade or Detroit, will find the same memorable characters and the story-driven element of the game. And finally, we always try to expand a little bit the audience by finding some affinities with things that are outside the field of video game. It's very important because it will give you ideas in your communication and also because there might be something for those people to be excited in your game. In the case of Plague Tale, we have low fantasy and grounded fantasy, so people who like Vikings of Game of Thrones are really likely to find something in the game that they will like. Next, we have probably the most important, which are the communication pillars. Starts, of course, with the promise. The promise, which is the pillar itself, it's about finding the most exciting, clear, universal promise that your game has to offer. It can be anything. It can be about story. It can be about a certain gameplay mechanic. It can be about the world. I generally recommend for the first communication pillar for it to be actually about a promise, about a fantasy more than a gameplay mechanic. For example, in the case of Space Marine 2, the promise, the first pillar, is to embody a superhuman galactic warrior. And after that, once we have that promise, we're going to look at every single element in the game that supports it and enhances it. For each of the pillar, and that's quite interesting, we do a SWOT, so strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. Here, the goal is to be as honest as possible with ourselves. If you have the best physics simulation on the market, write it down. But if you have, for example, a branching story, which is great, but it doesn't compare with some of the biggest titles in that area, you could put it in the weakness or something as a trap or a threat to avoid during communication. Same thing in terms of external threats. Potentially, there are controversial topics in your game that concern that specific pillar. So it's always great to write all those. Next, we have one of the things that's my favorite aspect of it, because I feel that it really opens up your brain, is to look at similar titles and competitors for that specific pillar. It creates affinities and links that you wouldn't necessarily expect at first, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. And finally, what are the key takeaways? What are the lessons that we get from this analysis? It can be something like to always show combat mechanics through the prism of emotion and story, because it's not the most technical. Or to don't mention the quantity of features, but actually focus on how they are unique. It's very important to get those key takeaways, because the goal into the communication after that for some asset is to answer those very specific problems that you have identified. And finally, we do that for each communication pillar, all of them at the same time. We really want to keep it to only 3 communication pillars, because we want to keep a simple, strong, and coherent message throughout the communication. If we have too many pillars, it's going to be diluted in the communication and hard to follow for the gamers. And if you don't have enough, to be honest, sometimes there might be something wrong about your game. It's okay. It's okay to look back at it and ask yourself, okay, is there actually a promise that is strong enough in my game, that stands out, that I can do trailers about, that I can do talks about and dev blogs? So it's okay to go back a little bit and think about those when you're doing your game. All right, so what is the goal of those creative guidelines? To have clear, strong communication pillars, to set the tone and the style of the communication assets, be aware of the traps and threats of the question that we'll have to answer during the communication, and of course have a great idea of the similar title and competitors by pillar. So keep in mind that this arrived at the production gate. So most of the time, there's still going to be quite some development time before you do actual communication of the game. That's okay. It's something that you can adapt throughout the process. And also, we realized that it was very helpful for our production teams as well as the development teams we work with to have those, because it helps them also crystallize the vision and the promise of the game. And when you're in production and you have to choose between 2 features because you don't have time, you'll be like, okay, what feature is actually benefiting one of the fantasy that I'm selling? And maybe focus on that one, make it right, and take away the other one. All right, so a lot of talking. Now I'd like to look at some examples. I want to show you an example with the game Snowrunner, because I think it's interesting, because simulation games are a little bit different and obey to certain codes. And in some ways, sometimes you can be a bit creative. So Snowrunner is a truck simulation, off-road truck simulation game developed by Saber Interactive, where you have to explore wide open worlds, evolve your truck, and it's very sandboxy and systemic type of gameplay. One of the problems that we had was, how do we sell a truck game to non-sim fans? And also one thing that was interesting that I wanted to share with you today. So this is, for example, one of the communication pillars we had for that game: make your mark on an untamed world. So when looking at the competitors for that pillar, we started with some of the most obvious one. And after that, when you look, that's why I really insist on the fact that you do competitive mapping for the specific pillars. When we started looking a bit deeper, well, some unexpected things arrived. And you will tell to yourself, like, what is Zelda Breath of the Wild doing on the truck sim game? Well, actually, we kind of liked the idea. And we thought to ourselves, like, in the end, what if we advertised Snowrunner as an open world RPG? Because there's elements of the fantasy in that game that will actually resonate with maybe players that are not into sim games. And that's one of the most universal promise. So we started considering the screenshot and the promotional assets for the game as if it was an open world RPG. Here, you just replace the vehicle with the hero and his sword on the back, and you have the classics of open world exploration. Same thing here. I don't know if you can see properly. It seems a bit dark. But again, so we really wanted to play on this exploration feeling. Where it reached its climax is a little bit closer to the release of the game, when we can allow ourselves to think a little bit outside the box. We have convinced our core and secondary audience at this stage, so we can be a little bit more creative. So I believe it was 2020. Death Stranding was the game that was trending a lot. We had this open world exploration pillar, and we were like, okay, what can we do about the game to start interesting and reach people who don't care about sim? How do we give purpose to those truck drivers? And so we ended up with this trailer.
Hey, it's me. We're doing okay. We miss much as we need you right now, the world needs you more.
So it's over the top and cheesy and doesn't take itself seriously. Of course, it's a nice little wink at Death Stranding, but it was funny to do something like that. And I don't think that we would have this reference if we hadn't done the creative guidelines beforehand. You still have to be flexible. This trailer performed incredibly well, and the reaction were like really like super excited about it. We managed to create something that was a bit unexpected for a simulation title. At least it connected it a little bit to the real world. It gave purpose to the drivers. Another example that's completely different, much more artistic, I would say, is for Plague Tale: Innocence. So Plague Tale is an action adventure game created by Asobo Studio with a strong emphasis on story and memorable characters. It puts you into the shoes of Amicia and Hugo, two young orphans in France's 14th century that try to escape from the Inquisition and uncover the secrets behind the rat plague, sorry. Another great success, both commercial and critical. So here's a look at two of the communication pillars for that game. One was about the emotional journey, about the relationship between the brother and the sister. So definitely the pure story pillar. And then we had another pillar, pillar number 3, actually about the grounded fantasy universe. This was the pillar that correspond the most with people who liked Game of Thrones and Vikings. So by looking at those toward the end of the communication, again, when we needed to think outside the box, we came up with an idea for which the goal was to seduce and resonate with the people who like the TV series that I had mentioned. So that's how we ended up having Sean Bean interpret a poem from William Blake called Little Boy Lost. It fits because it was the moment where Game of Thrones season 6 was releasing. Well, sadly, what happened. But at least it was a good way to say, okay, you prefer the first season, let's go back to the origin. Let's go back to Sean Bean. And for the poem, it was great because it's a very emotional and arty game. So it was good for us to have that element as well of poetry in the game. So let's look at the trailer. Because it's arrived at the end of the communication was to expand the audience. The goal was to reach media outlets that weren't necessarily about video games, and that's what we did. We had articles in magazines that were more dedicated to film in general and to TV series. Let's look at some other examples that arrived earlier in the communication. So this time at a key art for Evil West, a game created by Flying Wild Hog, super talented studio behind Shadow Warrior 2 and 3. If you want to leave, you have an opportunity, or else be ready for that. Okay, so this is the equivalent. So these are, again, it's mural. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the goal is so we have mood boards, we have images from the game, we have different mockups and stuff. But what I want to focus on is how we put to good use the similar titles that we had identified during the creative guidelines. So let's take a closer look at that. So ton of fantastic games. If you haven't played them, I highly encourage you to do so. So the goal here is to understand what is the collective, the subconscious collective thinking about action games. And when gamers who played these games see our title in retail or online, we want them to think to themselves, that's my kind of game, as we were saying. So if you're StarCraft or Elder Scrolls, sure, you can get away with just putting your logo on the box, but because you don't need to appeal to the collective subconscious, you are the collective subconscious. In our case, and with most of the projects, you are trying to establish a new brand. So it's important that the very first contact of the gamers with your game works and be like, okay, this corresponds to the type of games that I've played in the past. So in that case, what do we learn from that, from action games? Well, main character facing the camera, strong attitude, medium to full feet shot, and visible weapon. And that's for those specific type of games. If we look at other examples, like the similar titles and competitors for Plague Tale, it was a completely different story. Here you can see that for games that have a strong emotional component and strong and memorable characters, a lot of the time you'll have close-up on faces. Again, fantastic games. Go play them if you haven't. But here you will see there will be no weapon, just pure facial emotions, a little bit like what you will see on Netflix, actually, most of the time for their key arts for the TV series. Let's get back to Evil West. So here's some internal mock-up we did on Unreal Engine with our cinematic artist. And here is the final render. So what I want to convey here is that it's important to have the codes of the genre that you're pushing, because it's going to facilitate the attention, like from people who like that type of game. But you really have to make it your own, and it still has to have some attitude. It still has to have something unique that make it stands out, correspond to the collective subconscious, but still stand out and be memorable. In that case, it's the wonderful art style from Gabs, a fantastic artist that did the final pass on the game, that makes it like different, a bit closer to comics, which have a more over the top and irreverentious type of storytelling. And also we are over the top in the composition as well. There's way too many monsters on this key art. And we have this hero with this badass pose. So for me, we have all the good ingredients that make it a good key art, if your objective is to have a maximum number of players playing your game. Quick note about that. Most of the time when you're doing an asset and it has to exist on the shelves or even on the digital store, it's important to crank up a little bit saturation and contrast. So on the left here, you have the original artwork from Gabs, which is fantastic. In terms of pure artistic level, I think it's much stronger. So we kept it for the store exclusive on our Focus store, but the one that's going to exist on the shelves is going to be that one, because it needs to stand out. It's kind of what I was saying about marketing versus art. You have to be aware of those. If we go back to Plague Tale and we look at the competitors, we saw a lot of close-up shots. So we knew that if we wanted to appeal also to players who liked The Last of Us or games like Detroit or even Hellblade, it was important to have the same sort of like codes. But here, the twist is that it's the only game in that genre that has two characters, actually. So we put that to good use on top of adding the rats. Same example here on the right, you have the key art that you will find on Steam, on the shelf, Xbox, PlayStation. And on the left, you have the one that's for the collector edition. Again, for the collector edition, you don't need to speak to the collective subconscious, because it's for people who already know the game and want to buy that collector edition. So here, go full arty, go super creative, do what your clones will like, and that's going to be nice. For naming, I think you got the point here to look at the competitive landscape. So I'll go quickly about the naming. I don't think I need to tell you which side is about action games with at least some action component, and which side is about narrative-driven games. So make sure you take that into account when choosing your assets. Now about timing and purpose, which is very important. So scientific research says that people actually make buying decisions based on emotions, and after that look for logic and rational thinking to justify their emotion. Personally, I really like the analogy of heart and mind. When should you have an asset that speaks to the heart, and when should you have an asset that speaks to the mind? Definitely start with the heart. At the beginning of the communication, in the awareness phase, the goal is to spark emotions into the people who will see your asset. It's extremely important that you are as wide as possible in terms of who you are targeting, but also that you focus on what is the key promises and the fantasy of your game. This is not the time for analytical explanation of the core features. It's all about the story that you're telling and the fantasy that you are selling. I highly recommend nowadays to still add some gameplay in a reveal trailer, But if you are scared that there's too much differences between a cinematic shot and the actual gameplay, you can always put it as a post-credit sequence. But honestly, that's very respectful of players. People will thank you for it. And also, in some way, it speaks to the heart too, to see some gameplay. It makes the whole promise tangible and concrete. After that, during the engagement phase, this is where you try to educate, you try to justify the emotions that were generated by the reveal asset. So for example, this is where you will have a gameplay overview or explanatory asset. But most importantly, this is the moment where you have to answer the specific question and traps and threats that you had identified in the creative guidelines. It's super important. Something like you're doing a tactical game that has a lot of story, you know that some players will have a preconception that tactical games cannot deliver a good story because of the perspective. So let's prove them wrong with an asset. Or combat looks accessible, but it might lack depth, sorry. So you want to show how technical your combat is actually. Or another example, farming is not cool. Well, let me show you that farming can be cool. Uh, the last phase, oh, sorry. The last phase for the conversion, also known as people buying the game, oh, fancy transition, is you have to go back to the heart again. The goal now is that you have done your educational work. People know your core and secondary audience. They know about your game. They're convinced that they should buy it. You have answered all the problems. Now it's time to shake things up a little bit. So this is a good moment to actually do things that are a little bit outside the box, like for example, putting hip hop music on a medieval stealth action game based on the Robin Hood IP, like Hood, Outlaws and Legend, or the two trailers that we saw earlier. Those two trailers only make sense because they arrive at this stage. It would have made absolutely no sense to start the communication with those. So this is the good moment to think outside the box and to kind of shift things up in terms of communication. And finally, the launch trailer. Of course, if you have live ops or if you're doing accolades, it's not the final one, but let's consider it final for the example. So this one should definitely be a celebration of all your communication pillars in an uplifting, easy to access way. It's something where you have to absolutely have the entirety of your communication pillars, whatever they are. And it has to be fun. It has to be a celebration. It has to be an invitation to have some good time with the game. So, of course, this is an extremely simplified vision, but I hope it gives you an idea and that you find all of that useful. Uh, Finally, a couple of words about the fact that ultimately all of this is worth nothing if you're not making a good game. So it's great to have those in mind. They're here to maximize the potential of your game, but absolutely what you need is a good game with a strong vision for all of that to work. So personally, I'm a firm believer that out of the many ingredients that are required to create a good game, the one that's probably one of the most important is to have a personal, some personal emotion injected into the game. It's important that, as we were saying earlier, you do the game that you want to make. This is the thing that's going to make a little gem out of nothing. This is the element for me that can allow you to create things like Plague Tale, Innocence, and Requiem, because they come from the heart of the developers. So ultimately, I really recommend you to. I'll take one example. Like as a publisher at Focus, we receive thousands of pitch every year. And I can tell you that sometimes we see pitches that start with a lot of business analysis and market analysis. And the conclusion is that, oh, we look at all this market analysis and we're going to create that game. It's going to please the audience. I can tell you that personally, like if I see that in a pitch, I will be like, it's going to be very, very hard to convince me to like your pitch. Speak to our heart first and then to our mind. It's exactly the same thing. What we really like is when we have a personal vision carried by developers who actually have the means also to execute that vision. So, do the game you want to make. How we communicate on the game, though, it's a bit of a different story. So, do the game you want to make, but also show the game that people want to see. It's very important, like how we present it to the developers so that they see, sorry, to the gamers so that they see something that resonates with the games they like. It's extremely important. Still, please be honest, never lie about the content, be aware of your weaknesses and adapt your message accordingly. Make sure that every single asset that you create is actually answering a problem that you have spotted. Same as every shot in a film should add something to the story and serve a purpose. I have a final confession to make. I lied to you earlier when I said that this was bad news. This is actually fantastic news, and I hope that you embrace it. Thank you very much. So thank you a lot for your time, and yeah, super happy to answer some question if you have some. And we have one right here.
Hi, that was a really great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Would you be able to give us a bit more information on how you decide on those 3 core marketing pillars, please?
Of course. So generally, we're not just like, okay, this is one pillar and that's the right one. We actually, like most of the time, try to write at least 7, 8, or 10 pillars. So a good way to start giving yourself ideas about that is starting by listing all the USPs, so all the unique selling points that you have in your game, and all the KSPs. So once you have all that elements, like super technical combat would be a key selling point, or a feature that doesn't exist would be a unique selling point, or the setting, maybe there's no game with that setting. Once you have all that list, you look at the ones that are the strongest, the one that excite you the most, and then you can start putting them into a range and see how they can interact with one another. And you can have various aspects, but this you absolutely have to speak with the developers. Most of the time, it's going to be a vision that they will have originally in the pitch, but sometimes you may have some surprises, and also you may need to actually clarify that vision. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Any hands? Yes, over there.
Hi, really interesting. If we're going on a DIY approach to marketing, as you've described here, where's the best place to start with your initial awareness campaign if you've got a new product or a new studio?
Yes, sure. You mean in terms of reveal?
Yeah, to kick things off with your new game that nobody's ever heard of, nobody's ever heard of your company as a startup. Where's best place to go?
Well, the best places I would say are the ones that gather the most views for sure. So definitely the Game Awards are great, or Summer Game Fest, or conferences like Xbox or PlayStation. A PlayStation State of Play can be great. A Nintendo Direct can be great as well. Most of the time, it's often going to be better if you're part of an event that a lot of people will see and watch. In terms of timing, because maybe I didn't clarify that aspect, generally we recommend nowadays, because there's like 7,000 games released on Steam every year, to try to have a shorter communication window than what we used to have in the past. So I would say for a AA plus kind of title, 6 to 9 months is enough, so that when you attack the ocean of releases, you concentrate all your marketing budget on few assets, but that are going to be able to pierce the wave of the competition. So it's kind of like the bomb versus bullet strategy. And I think that's very helpful. Now, for an indie game, if you just have enough to make 2 or 3 assets, just from the type of game that you're making, then I think that 3 to 1 month is actually okay. For the big assets, now once everything that you want to do in terms of community, of sharing some elements while you're creating the game, it's something different, because I'd really like to point out the differences between the announcement of the game and the actual kickoff of the communication. So for me, a reveal trailer is not necessarily the kickoff of the communication. A reveal is when you reveal the game, and the kickoff can be actually maybe 1 or 2 years later. But once you start spending your marketing budget and activating all the levers, you have to go rather fast, because you have to keep being on the top compared to other players. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you.
Cool. Any other people have questions? 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you, everyone. You can go have a beer. Thanks a lot.